I remember a cartoon by that wonderful humorist, Harry Hirschfield. It was on the dedication page of his book, and there were hundreds and hundreds of hands that were reaching up through this dedication page. And at the bottom, Mr. Hirschfield had written, "To my relatives who can hardly wait for the royalties."
Travel along, Catholic pilgrims, for 1 year as we learn from Venerable Fulton Sheen, one of the greatest Catholic teachers in modern times. Join me, Amy Thomas, once a week for a short reading out of Bishop Sheen's book, Way to Inner Peace. Hey, Catholic pilgrims, welcome to week 25. Can you believe that we only have one more week to go before we are at the halfway point? I cannot believe that. So far, it has been an absolutely great ride, and I'm very much looking forward to today's readings. What we're going to be talking about is when good people do wrong. And there's so much I want to say about today's readings that I'm just not going to have time. But as we're reading through this, I'm going to say some things that may be a little difficult to hear, and that you might at first think I'm trying to let people off the hook, something like that, but I'm not. Hang with me, listen till the end, and maybe then take it and just really think about it. I'm not saying I'm completely right on all this, but I do think that Bishop Sheen is going to touch on something that I think a lot of us need to think about. So the 3 points I would have us think about are repentance, anxiety, and agony. Number 25, when good people do wrong. The good sometimes do wrong. Let us face it. And when they do wrong, it is not the same as the evil who do wrong. Evil is an exception in the life of the good. It cuts across the long road of their life as a tangent. But with the evil, good is an exception. A master pianist may hit a wrong note, but everyone still knows him to be a good pianist. A beginner may hit a right note, but everyone knows that he is not a good player. As a result, the inner workings of the mind are quite different in the good doing wrong and the evil doing evil. In the latter, a hardening process sets in. Conscience first shouts. Then, after repeated chokings, it becomes so weak it can only whisper. Finally, its voice is stifled altogether. Since such people willed to have no moral law except of their own making, God leaves them alone. It is terrible for the soul when God pursues it and drives it to perfection, but it is more terrible still when he leaves the soul to its own conceits. The psychological effect is entirely different when those who truly love God do wrong. The difference between them and others is like to that being a waif who steals and a devoted son who steals. The first does not feel the rupture of a relationship, the second does. The latter has hurt one whom he really loves. Furthermore, the waif does not feel the urge to restore the broken buds of love, but the ordinary good boy does. There is a mysterious magnet operating in the case of the good. As the steel filings fly to the attraction of the magnet, leaving the dirt behind, so the good are pulled back again to God, but only after having shaken the dust of evil from their lives. Picture 2 men married to 2 old shrews. One man was married before to a beautiful, wise, devoted wife who died. The other was never married before. Which of the 2 suffers the more? Obviously, the man who once knew love and happiness. So it is with doing evil. He who has known the inner peace of soul that comes from union with God undergoes greater agony and torture in his sin than the one who never was ushered into such treasures. The rich who become poor suffer more than the poor who never were rich. The soul which offends God whom he loves suffers more than the soul who willed not to have God in his life. This does not mean that the evil do not experience an agony. In the good, the effect of doing evil is moral and leads to repentance. In the evil, the effect is physical and psychological. It shows less in the soul and more in the mind and the body. The moral effect is sorrow, contrition, repentance, which leads to a restoration of fellowship with God and therefore peace. The physical or psychological effect is anxiety, fear, worry, psychosis, and neurosis. The good take to their knees when they do wrong. The evil, if they have enough money, betake themselves to a couch. The good want their sins forgiven. The evil want them explained away. The good recover peace of soul. The evil have to be satisfied with peace of mind. The explanation of this phenomenon is that the good have another principle of action in them than the evil. The evil are guided solely by the thought either of the satisfaction of the flesh or the spirit, and that this world is all. But the good have another principle in them entirely above nature, which is called grace. And by it they are united to God. This principle of grace is always rising up against their sin and generally triumphs over it with the slightest cooperation of the will. A man refrains from adultery because of the love he has for his wife. This principle of love militates against his carnal desires, and if he falls, pushes him back again to fidelity. So with grace. St. Paul wrote to the pagan Romans, quote, I don't understand my own actions because instead of doing what I want to do, I do what I hate. Now, if I don't want to do the very thing that I actually do, then I agree with the law that it is, in fact, good. Romans 7:15-16. That is the point. The very regret one has is an admission that the law of God is right. A child told by his parents not to stick his finger in the fire does so, but he immediately discovers that their law was worthy of all honor. There are two ways of knowing how good God is. One is never to lose him. The other is to lose him and find him again. If you've followed me for any length of time, then you know what my educational background is in. If you don't, I'll clue you in. I am a criminologist. I went into criminology for my bachelor's degree, and then in my master's degree, I studied applied behavioral science, specializing in sexual violence, which is a deep, dark topic that no one ever really wants to talk about. Anyway, as I said, I'm also just a criminologist, so I have worked with police departments, sheriff's departments, those types of things. And when we lived in Florida, I was a part of a cold case team down there, which I absolutely loved being a part of. The thing with the line of work that I've been in and my studies and the things that I have done, I have witnessed the very, very evil sides of humanity. Most people go through this life knowing that it's there. I think most people know that it's there. But most people don't have to come face to face with it like some people do. You know, detectives, police officers, criminologists, forensic evidence people. We just come face to face with the worst in humanity, and it's difficult. I guess, but somebody's got to do it. The thing that those of us that have worked in this field come to realize is that there are some people that are so given over to evil that it is very difficult to get them back. Now, I worked a lot with the court system, and I was always trying to stress to judges that if you get a pedophile in front of you, you get a sexual abuser, just lock them away. Now, I know this goes against our Christian beliefs that we should have hope in people, that they can change, that Christ can change them. And I completely agree with that. I don't think it's impossible for God to reach people. However, the soul has to be a receiving one, right? And I think a lot of times what happens is when confronted with evil, even just a little bit, a lot of people don't want to really call it for what it is because we're all sinners. I mean, this is a reality. We all sin. We all mess up. We all offend God with our sin. And so there is this idea that, well, because I'm a sinner, I can't tell other people that what they're doing is really bad. I cannot judge their actions in any way. Who am I to say anything? I'm a sinner too. And I think this is really, really wrong thinking. And again, like I said, walk with me through this podcast and just listen and hear what I have to say. So when I was in Florida and I was working with the cold case team for the Bay County Sheriff's Department, I had this one case that hadn't been solved. It was a murder of a woman, and the cops had a pretty good idea of who they thought did it, but we really needed a confession. And so part of my job as a person who studies criminal behavior was to try to figure out a way to get this person to confess. Now, this guy that the detectives were pretty sure was the guy who had committed this particular murder that I was studying, he was already in prison. He and his brother were already in prison for another murder. And so it wasn't as if he wasn't locked away. Mostly they wanted to solve the crime, give the family closure, and that sort of thing. So as I was going over the case and everything, just reading about him, his life and everything, we came up with this plan to try to get him to confess. And it was a pretty good plan, I actually have to say. Basically, I was going to pose as a research assistant to a major well-known author. And the author was supposedly going to be writing a major book on infamous serial killers. And we were trying to gather information. And he possibly was one of Florida's most prolific serial killers. However, because he wasn't confessing to a lot of the murders that the detectives, kind of were pinning on him, we needed him to confess to these crimes. And he was already in prison, so what do you have to lose, really? So we had this whole plan. And the first part of the plan was going to his mother's house to talk to her because she was a very overbearing woman and she basically ruled her boys' lives, which is uncommon in a serial killer's life. And we were going to try to get her to encourage her son to confess because of potential money involved and a movie possibly made about him. So we drove out to his house, which is kind of out in the country. It was his mother's house, actually. And if I could describe evil in a house, that house would be it. There was just something utterly sinister about that house. Now, it wasn't unkept. It was very clean, in fact. The property was very nice. The house was not neglected or anything like that. They had actually found the body of another victim on the property, so that was, a little eerie. Anyway, I just walked into the house and it was a very tangible weight that I could feel walking into that house. You just could feel the evil. And I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible because it felt so heavy. It felt almost like walking through a portal into hell. Anyway, we talked to the mom. We told her that, we were looking to possibly get a confession on this particular crime. There was a lot of evidence that he had committed the crime, and if he would just confess, it would make it a lot easier. All those kinds of things. Anyway, long story short, the mother does actually encourage her sons to confess to the crime. And we end up going to the prisons to meet with the brother and the main guy, who is the main serial killer. He kind of had his brother as a sidekick. So I met him. I met both of them, actually. And, most people in their lives are never going to have the experience of sitting across from a serial killer. And his brother actually confessed to the crime, told us where the weapon was. We found the weapon. We located it. He told us what happened that night. It was a lot of really good information and evidence that the police could really use. Unfortunately, I never got to see the end of it because we moved away because my husband's in the military. Anyway, sitting across from the main guy, the main serial killer, he was shorter than me. He wasn't a very big man. He was older now, from the pictures that I had seen, through the case file. He was a younger guy, but he'd been in prison for a while, so he was older. And, there was just something about him. Bishop Sheen talks about here in our readings, he says, in the evil, the effect is physical and psychological. It shows less in the soul and more in the mind and the body. And that's so true. I could just see it. I could just see the evil in him, which is sad. I mean, it's really sad to say that. It's sad to say that there are evil people in the world. He had no remorse. In fact, he didn't care about the murder that he was already in prison for. He was like just a person that was in existence. There was no joy, completely devoid of joy, no smile, just gone. It's hard to describe what I saw. It really is. And like I said, most people do not come face to face with these kinds of characters in the world. And I have, I have seen rapists. I have seen child molesters. I have seen what they've done. I have unfortunately seen the work that they have done, work, quote unquote. And it's just simply demonic. There's just no other way to describe it. And it's so important that we understand this because, as I said, yes, we are all sinners. We are fallen creatures and we all sin. But we don't do the world any justice when we act as though everybody who sins is exactly the same in their sin. This is why the Catholic Church gives us venial and mortal sins. Because, everybody is committing venial sins. And even good people are. But not everybody's committing mortal sins. And those that have sunk themselves into mortal sin, you can see it. You can see it. And the longer they go and the more mortal sins they engage in, the darker and darker and darker their souls get. And it's truly sad. Now, Christ is the only one who has the potential to reach them, honestly. But it is something that we have to be very aware of. And it's okay. It is okay to say that certain actions that people are committing are evil. Because there's this tendency to say, oh, yeah, I don't want to call anybody out. I'm a sinner, and, I'm going to be judged, and God's going to judge me, and we shouldn't be judging, and all this. But, we have to at a certain level. We have to call evil evil. There are evil people in the world. And deep down we know this. And by playing this false humility where we're pretending that all sins are basically the same and that, just because, maybe I'm a sinner, I cannot tell you that you're doing anything wrong, or I can't call your sin worse than maybe what I'm doing. The things that I've seen are horrific. And they're not the same as somebody who tells a little white lie or who steals a lollipop. And they're just not the same, not even close. And you can see the difference in the good and the evil. And I think Bishop Sheen spells it out so perfectly here. I want to go back to the beginning. Right at the front, he says, the good sometimes do wrong, let us face it. And when they do wrong, it is not the same as the evil who do wrong. It's just not the same. And when we try to play nice and try to be polite, we continue to allow this evil to occur in our midst, and it wreaks havoc on people's lives. He goes on to say, as a result, the inner workings of the mind are quite different in the good doing wrong and the evil doing evil. He says in the evil, a hardening process sets in. Conscience first shouts, then after repeated chokings, it becomes so weak it can only whisper, and then finally its voice is stifled altogether. You know, that's exactly the description of many of the people I have witnessed in my line of work, and the serial killer especially. There was just darkness. There was no voice, pricking his soul. And Bishop Sheen tells us what's happened here. He says, since such people willed to have no moral law except of their own making, God leaves them alone. He leaves them alone. And he says it is terrible for the soul when God pursues it and drives it to perfection. But it is more terrible still when he leaves the soul to its own conceits. And I have seen that with my own eyes. Ask any detective and they will tell you the same thing. And we cannot pretend that good people doing wrong and evil people doing evil are anywhere on the same level as each other. That's not to say that we don't look at ourselves and examine ourselves and try to get back to making sure our souls are clean. It doesn't mean any of that. And it doesn't mean that we look at everybody else and judge and never look at ourselves. That's not what it means. But when we neglect to see actual evil and call it for what it is, because we're afraid of looking too judgy or not being humble enough, I'm telling you, it does real harm. And he says here, there is a mysterious magnet operating in the case of the good. As the steel filings fly to the attraction of the magnet, leaving the dirt behind, so the good are pulled back again to God, but only after having shaken the dust of evil from their lives. This is something that we have to remember. Good people in the world, when they've done wrong, they feel it. They feel it, and they want to make amends. They want to get it right. They want to set things back to rightness. And so they will either apologize or, they go to confession and they confess their sins and they ask God for forgiveness and they're repentant and they strive to not do it again. And they live their lives in such a way where they don't want to do wrong things. Like St. Paul, I don't want to do wrong things. I just do it sometimes. And I don't really know why. And it comes down usually to pride and selfishness and trying to have my own way. But those that are connected to God, and he talks about grace, those that have grace in their souls, when we do wrong, we're able to be pulled back like a magnet to God. And we know what we need to do to set it right. He says the good want their sins forgiven. The evil want them explained away. They want them to even be accepted, completely tolerated, even celebrated sometimes. And so we have to remember that as Christians, it is our job to shine light into darkness. The first person that we should be shining light at is ourselves and into our own souls. We need to be examining ourselves. We need to have those examinations of conscience. We should be asking people that know us very well, is there anything that I should be working on? Is there anything that I'm missing? Because I want to be a holy person. And when we do mess up, a good person knows what to do. They need to apologize, need to set it right, need to go to confession. It's not the same with the evil. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because there is true evil going on in our world today, and people are reluctant to call it for what it is. It is our job to root out evil. We are to be the bearers of truth, the bearers of light, salt of the earth. That is what we are called to be. And we cannot do that when we're trying to play nice and not offend anybody ever at all. And we're trying to be so polite that it ends up, just allowing people to continue down paths that are bad for them. Obviously, we have to be charitable. We have to be charitable people. We don't need to stand in front of people and say, you're the most evil person in the world and you're going to hell. We do not get to judge anybody to hell. That is God's domain alone. But we can say what you are doing is evil. It is evil and wrong. And it has to stop. And I cannot be a part of this. And I want better for you. Those are the things that we have to say. And, it's hard to do. It really is hard to do. Trust me, I know this. But with God's graces and His guidance and His help, we can, fight against evil. And that's really what we should be doing. So that is all for this week, Catholic Pilgrims. I will see you back here for week 26. And until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.